Family vanished from a Maine cabin in 1991. What police found in 2023 left. Everyone speechless. Moosehead Lake, Greenville, Maine. August 2023. Early morning. The lake lay still, a sheet of mist so thick it felt like you could reach out and touch it. On a floating survey platform, the environmental team stood silent, eyes fixed on the sonar screen where faint green lines flickered, sketching something deep below. Sheriff Douglas Harris stood on the shore, his aging eyes still holding the sharpness of the rookie he'd once been more than 30 years ago. He knew this lake. He'd walked the wooden steps of that old cabin. He'd once stared down at a pair of children's shoes neatly lined up on the porch. And he'd made himself a quiet promise back then to find out what really happened. The sonar beeped and the screen flashed. A large box-shaped mass appeared buried in the cold mud below, wrapped in chains, locked tight. No one on the platform said a word, but they all felt it. The lake was finally about to give back one of the secrets it had swallowed for 3 long decades. Sheriff Harris slowly stepped onto the dock. The early wind swept across the water, carrying the chill of the forest and something older, heavier. He drew a breath, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Out of habit, his eyes locked on the water. Out there, the metallic shape was rising. Moosehead Lake, Greenville, Maine. The sky that day was grayer than usual. When the dark container finally broke the surface, the lake seemed to groan a low, cold breath that hung heavy in the air. The chains scraped against the crane hook with a shrill metallic whine, water dripping steadily from the rusted edges, each drop echoing like a clock in a quiet room. The survey crew stepped back, clearing the platform for the homicide investigators. Every pair of eyes followed Sheriff Douglas Harris as he walked to the edge of the floating deck, his figure calm but unyielding. He stopped just beside the container, staring down at the brown-streaked chains and corroded locks sunk into layers of green algae. Harris said nothing. He only nodded slightly, signaling for the technicians to clear the platform and drape a temporary nylon cover over the box, readying it for transport. One young deputy nearby murmured under his breath, "Could just be junk, Sheriff." Harris glanced up at him, his eyes sharp as a blade, and the boy fell silent. "Junk doesn't lock itself up," Harris said evenly. He stepped back, watching, as the crane swung the container slowly onto the truck bed. A sudden wind swept across the lake, scattering fine ripples through the glassy water. Harris quietly slipped his hand into his pocket, turning the old ring on his finger, never taking his gaze off that slab of wet, silent steel. In his mind, the memories came flooding back. Cabin 4, August 1991. A sweltering afternoon. He, just 28 at the time, had walked into that cabin with another deputy. 4 pairs of shoes neatly lined on the porch, the faint smell of charcoal still lingering from the grill, damp towels hanging from the railing. On the table, 2 juice boxes, half drunk, still sweating with condensation. No crying, no screaming. No one. Just the heavy silence of a family of 4. Gone. Since then, he'd told himself to forget, or at least to pretend. But looking at that waterlogged container now, everything he'd buried felt like mud dredged up from the bottom of the lake. When the truck rumbled away from the dock, Harris turned to his lieutenant, his voice low but firm. "Take it to the station. Seal it up. Call the forensics team out of Bangor. Call the FBI too. Tell them this isn't a drill." He looked back at the lake, its morning mist beginning to break. A thin shaft of sun cut through the clouds and glimmered across the rippling surface. But to Harris, that light brought no comfort. He knew from this moment Moosehead Lake would no longer sleep quietly. And this was just the beginning. The damp container was hauled into the Piscataquis County Sheriff's lot, under a heavy tarp, its moss-streaked steel leaving a dark, wet trail across the concrete. Inside the forensics bay, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the scene. Gloved hands moved methodically, scanners, humming cameras, snapping pens, scratching notes. No one raised their voice. No one dared break the quiet. Douglas Harris stood just beyond the thick observation glass arms, folded his eyes unblinking, as the technicians worked. On the X-ray monitor, two faint curled silhouettes appeared, shapes anyone who'd seen enough crime scenes would recognize instantly. His fists tightened until his nails bit into his palms. The room suddenly felt colder. The chains came off first, each rusted link clattering to the floor like iron bones. Then slowly, the lid cracked open. A sour stench of chemicals, damp rot, and something faintly sweet death, long sealed, rolled out heavy and cloying. A young technician stumbled back, hand over her mouth, but the others didn't flinch. They'd smelled it before. Inside lay two black, heavy-duty garbage bags, tightly bound with brittle, faded tape. Strands of yellowed hair and scraps of cloth poked through the seams. The first bag was opened with deliberate care. A child body, nearly mummified, still clad in an old bathing suit, a worn fabric bracelet clinging to its tiny wrist. The second bag followed a smaller frame, its hair clumped with lake mud, and between two frail hands a waterlogged stuffed frog, its seams dark and splitting. No one in the room spoke. The cameras flashed. Notes were scribbled. But Harris saw the glint in their eyes, saw how their hands trembled just so. The lake had kept its dark promise. He stood there a long while before turning and stepping outside into the lot. The air bit at his face. From his breast pocket, he pulled out a yellowing Polaroid, the one he'd found all those years ago on that cabin table, four faces smiling, wide sunlight glittering on the dock behind them. The children waving the father's arms, wrapped around his wife and daughter. The edges of the photo fluttered between his fingers in the chill breeze. Overhead, the gray sky rippled with a circle of crows, their wings cutting through the silence. Somewhere distant, a siren wailed, faintly carried on the wind. At his feet, on the wet asphalt, a single red autumn leaf tumbled down in slow spirals before settling still. Harris took a long breath. 32 years of waiting only to stand here now. But he knew this wasn't the end, because if the lake had finally given up part of the truth, then it still had more to keep. And he wasn't finished. The container was sealed and transported to the Maine State Medical Examiner's cold room that very night. Rain fell steadily on the highway, tapping against the truck's roof, like a slow, deliberate warning. In the stifling quiet of the morgue storage, the small bones were laid out on a stainless steel table, the harsh white light above making them look like pearls dredged from mud. A clump of muddy hair was lifted with tweezers, and the faded ribbon wrapped tight around the waterlogged frog was carefully unwound. Beneath the brittle fabric, faint letters emerged SW 8/1391. Harris stood behind the technicians, his eyes narrowing. The date, the initials of Sarah Wilson. He stepped out into the hallway where the Wilson family's case file lay, reopened, scattered across the table, yellowed crime scene photos, scribbled notes, a map of the dock, fragments of a nightmare come back to life. But one detail he'd never forgotten lingered in his mind. Back then, when he'd walked those wooden cabin steps, he'd noticed a strange, muddy print on the porch. Narrow, uneven, the left side dragging deeper. They'd dismissed it at the time. Harris tapped his finger on the edge of the table, his eyes landing on the list of employees who'd worked at the lodge that summer. At the very bottom in pencil, so faint it was nearly gone, Raymond Carter, Summer Maintenance, 1991. No address, no social security number, just a hastily scribbled note, temporary. The back of his neck went cold. The file room was still, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the wind hissed through the window frame, rustling loose sheets of paper. Harris opened the archive drawer, pulled out the original witness statements. Buried among the pages, one name rose like a blade, catching light. The only eyewitness, a retired schoolteacher renting cabin 2, had once mentioned seeing a gaunt, unfamiliar young man lurking near the dock the night before the family vanished. The only words he used to describe him, a limp and eyes like an empty pit. Harris closed the folder, slowly, his voice a low whisper. "You've been waiting there 30 years. Now it's my turn." On the table, the Polaroid of the Wilson family slipped back into view. That happy smile, those bright young eyes, the sunlit dock behind them, now nothing more than a faded photograph. Yet, at the edge of the frame, just behind the trees, Harris thought he could almost see it, a warped shadow waiting to step back into the light. He straightened. His coat stepped into the hall and told his aide to draft a federal warrant for Raymond Carter. In his mind, Moosehead Lake kept whispering, the black water glinting like the eyes of crows. He knew what was waiting out there wasn't just a killer. It was the ghost of a tragedy, a truth the lake had kept for 32 years, and this time he swore he'd drag it to shore himself. A day after the federal warrant was signed, posters went up all over the northern Maine backcountry. The name Raymond Carter resurfaced on record like a ghost alongside a grainy mugshot from his 1988 arrest. Gaunt, brown hair, matted eyes, dark and hollow. His mouth pressed tight as if barely holding back something violent. Harris sat in the command room, the opposite wall covered in maps of the woods around Moosehead Lake. Red pins dotted the paper, where witnesses once claimed to have seen him, where a trail camera had recently caught the limp and the thin silhouette just weeks ago, and most prominently, the path leading to an abandoned hunting shack where game wardens reported signs of recent occupancy. Piece by piece, Harris had stitched the fragments together. A shape was forming in his mind. The man had never truly left. He was still here, clinging to the dock, the cabin, as if this place was the only world he knew. On the second day, a tactical team breached the shack deep in the pines. Inside, it was dark, cold, the kind of dark that seemed to breathe. Ash lay cold in a rusty stove. A few empty cans of beans sat on the floor. A filthy sleeping bag lay curled in the corner. Harris knelt by the stove and picked up a moldy notebook, its cover warped, pages flaking to dust. He opened it and recognized the slanted, frantic handwriting. The first lines he read: "The girl kept screaming. I had to hit her. The man buried her where the lake couldn't touch." Harris closed the book, staring out at the dense forest beyond the door. The air felt colder now, though shafts of sunlight still broke through the trees in golden patches. He knew then, if the words in this book were true, what they'd found at the bottom of the lake was only part of it. Raymond Carter had done more. And he wasn't finished. That night, footage downloaded from an infrared trail camera a few miles from Cabin 4 played on the station monitors. On the screen, a hunched figure limping lingered at the edge of the woods, watching the lodge from the tree line. For a split second, his eyes flared under the infrared light before he melted back into the dark. Harris stared at the footage, his pulse pounding. He was still here, still watching, still waiting. On the caseboard, Harris pinned up a printout from the camera, the shadowy figure standing among the pines, eyes fixed on Cabin 4. He stepped back, breathing deep, his hand curling into a fist. No matter how deep the darkness of Moosehead Lake tried to hide him, Harris could feel him now. And this time, the darkness would not save him. On the third night, the woods around Moosehead Lake seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered faintly through the pines, rustling the darkness, and the lake lay still, not a ripple daring to rise. Cabin 4 had been painstakingly staged, just as it had been 32 years ago. The small shoes lined neatly on the porch, the damp towel draped over the railing, 2 paper cups of orange juice set on the table, beads of condensation clinging to them. All of it for one pair of eyes. The entire team lay in wait, spread through the trees, camouflaged in pine needles, their breaths quiet behind scarves. Overhead, an infrared drone circled silently, scanning every inch of the cold woods. The cabin glowed warm in the dark, a strange kind of beacon bait for the predator that didn't know the trap was already set. Douglas Harris stood alone at the edge of the dock, hands loose at his sides, eyes locked on the black tree line. Inside him, there was no more rage, only a cold, quiet resolve. 30 years of waiting had sharpened it into something like a blade. He knew the man wouldn't be able to resist. That ghost had bound itself to this lake long ago. And then, as if the lake itself exhaled, the figure emerged. From the right edge of the woods, he slipped out, half hidden among the trunks. That lurching, limping gait, the faded denim jacket hanging off his shoulders. His face still shrouded in shadow, but his eyes caught the moonlight for just a second, glowing like an animal's. No sound, no rush, just steady steps forward, as though he were walking through his own memory. Harris watched his hand reach into his pocket, pulling out a length of chain and a shining padlock that glinted under the pale moon. He stopped at the bottom of the cabin steps, but he didn't climb them. Instead, he turned toward the dock. His gaze cut straight through the warm-lit cabin and found Harris standing on the water's edge. Across the cold air their eyes met, and then he bolted, crashing back into the woods. The radios in the team's earpieces came alive in an instant. The drone above swooped lower, its thermal camera locking onto the heat signature as it darted and stumbled through the trees, that uneven, stubborn shadow refusing to disappear. Harris didn't wait for a signal. He left the dock, drawing his sidearm, plunging into the forest after him. Branches lashed his face. His breath came heavy. The team kept pace, their screens glowing with a red shape, moving ahead, dodging through the dark. At the lakeshore, among tall reeds that cut the moonlight, the man slipped and fell. His panicked eyes darted around fists, still clutching the chain and lock like talismans. The team closed in. Flashlights flared. Mud churned. His chest heaved in ragged, feral gasps. Raymond Carter was pinned to the cold mud. His breath shallow, his eyes wild. He still muttered, almost too faint to hear, "Not done. Lake. Keeps." But for Harris, it was already over. He stood there looking down at the man who had haunted the Wilson family and him for 32 years. Now just a shivering wreck in the mud. And for the first time, Moosehead Lake fell quiet. No more whispers. Only the faint clink of chain hitting the mud, as if the lake itself was closing its curse. Raymond Carter was brought back to the station that night, his sunken eyes still darting like a cornered animal, the cuffs biting into his wrists. In the cold interrogation room, he sat hunched, his denim jacket caked with mud, staring at the hanging bulb overhead, as if he could hear sounds no one else could. Douglas Harris entered, shutting the steel door behind him. The room thickened with silence. He stood there for a long moment, just watching the face across the table. The defiance from the night before was gone. In its place, something hollow, weary, and almost satisfied. Carter didn't smile. He didn't deny anything. He just murmured a few disjointed words over and over the lake. Keeps for me." Harris said nothing, just set the moldy notebook from the shack on the table, its warped pages now pressed flat, filled with Carter's jagged scrawl. Carter's gaze fell on it, and his mouth quivered faintly. Harris opened it to the final page. In heavy, near-torn pencil marks, it read, "He is the key." Harris felt his chest tighten. He stared at Carter a long moment, then slowly stood and walked out without a word. In the hallway, the forensics team was waiting, a fresh report in hand from the lab. Harris flipped through it. DNA from the lining of Carter's jacket matched blood from Mark Wilson. The pattern suggested Wilson had been seriously wounded that night, yet he'd never been found. Mark Wilson's name returned to the caseboard like a new challenge. Harris lifted his eyes to the map of Moosehead Lake. The red pins glowed under the harsh light. Among the black and white photos, the old Polaroid still stood out, the family's bright smiles, the blurred trees behind them hiding a faint shadow. He knew someone was still out there. Mark Wilson, the father, the survivor, or a witness trapped in his own private hell. And Harris wasn't about to let the man stay buried in silence like the lake itself. That night, as teams swept the tree-lined flashlights, cutting through brush and shale, Harris stood alone on the dock, listening to the black water breathe beneath his feet. The wind whispered through the pines, soft and steady. And somewhere in that quiet, he thought he heard a man's voice from far away. "I'm still here." And Harris closed his eyes, gripping the dock's edge, and whispered back, "I know." The next morning, the sky turned a heavy shade of slate, thick clouds dragging over Moosehead Lake as though threatening a late storm. Search teams still fanned out along the ridges, and gullies combing over rocky trails and damp ravines no one had walked in years. And then a signal came in from a remote trail camera deep in the forest. A blurry frame. A tall, gaunt man-beard grown wild, wearing a faded flannel shirt, limping slightly, his eyes distant like an animal cornered. In the corner of the image, the timestamp glowed clear, 5:12 a.m. Ridge Trail, nearly 4 miles from the lake. Douglas Harris heard the call and left at once. The truck rattled over the rough road in silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the steady thrum of his own pulse. They found an abandoned hunting shack tucked under the heavy pines. The wooden door was half rotted inside, cold and dim shafts of light breaking weakly through warped slats. Harris stepped slowly, his eyes sweeping each corner, his breath steady and deep. There crouched in the corner Mark Wilson, the man who for 32 years had been both a ghost in Harris's case files and a question that refused to die. He was thin to the bone, his hair long and silver, his eyes hollow, not angry, not afraid, just empty, as though he'd sunk too far into his own silence. Harris said nothing, only lowered himself to sit in front of him. For a long moment, they just stared, one carrying 30 years of pursuit, the other 30 years of flight. Mark's gaze drifted to the floor where a scrap of wood lay before him, crudely scratched with the names of his children, Sarah, Ethan, and at the end, a name Harris had never seen Eli. A fourth child. Harris felt a weight settle deep in his chest. In that moment, he knew Mark Wilson's loss ran deeper than any case file could ever tell. Mark's voice cracked into the still air, rough and faint. I couldn't save them. But I stayed. I had to stay. Harris lowered his eyes, then gave the faintest nod. And in the silence of that crumbling shack, he understood more clearly than ever he hadn't been the only one fighting the lake's curse all these years. This father had stayed behind, quietly carrying it alone. When they led Mark Wilson out, the rain began to fall. Thin, cold drops washed streaks through the mud, softening the footprints on the trail home, and far off the lake lay still watching. For the first time, Harris thought he could almost feel it breathing, not angry now, but lighter. Mark Wilson was brought back to the station in the light drizzle. He remained silent the entire way, his eyes occasionally drifting to the fogged-up window, watching the pines slide past in the dark. As they crossed the threshold into the station, the smell of wet earth and cold air gave way to the sterile white light and heavy stillness of a place that had heard too many confessions. Harris led him straight to the interview room. A thick case file already sat waiting on the table. On top lay the old Polaroid, the Wilson family smiling on the dock that final day, and the moldy journal of Raymond Carter. Mark didn't touch them. He just sat, his thin hands clasped together, his hollow eyes staring straight through the brick wall, as if it weren't there. Harris sat opposite him and quietly slid a new piece of evidence across the table. The child's bracelet recovered from Sarah's wrist, in the container, faintly etched with her name. Mark stared at it for a long time, his eyelids trembling, though not a single tear fell. Harris didn't have to ask. Mark spoke first, his voice dry and rough. I buried Janet. Up on the ridge. I didn't want him to find her to do what he did to the kids. I didn't know where he took Sarah and Ethan. I thought I'd killed him. But he came back. He always came back. His fingers clenched so tight, his knuckles went white. The room fell silent, save for the faint scratch of a pen somewhere behind the glass. Harris met his gaze and gave a faint nod. Now he understood everything. Raymond Carter didn't just kill, he hunted. He crushed a family piece by piece and left them to rot in silence. But Mark Wilson had chosen something else. He stayed. He buried himself in the deep woods, became part of the lake, sealing it all under layers of mud and memory, waiting for the day it could finally be told. That night, as a storm swept across Moosehead Lake, the station burned with light. Outside, the windows, rain lashed against the glass, washing the trees into gray smears. Alone in the records room, Harris stood before the caseboard, now thick with photos, maps, and timelines. He studied each face: the children, Janet, Mark. Quietly, he reached up, pulled the old Polaroid from the board, and tucked it into his breast pocket. Tomorrow, the Wilson family would be buried, all of them, together. And when the earth closed, maybe the lake would finally stop whispering. But tonight, he still heard it. And it was still calling their names. That day, Moosehead Lake was as still as if it had never known tragedy. The soft autumn sun scattered across the water maple leaves, blazing red and gold reflected like tiny flames drifting on the surface. On the hillside overlooking the lake, the town cemetery stood quiet, 4 simple pine caskets laid side by side, a white ribbon stretched across them, bearing each name: Janet Wilson, Sarah Wilson, Ethan Wilson, Eli Wilson. The crowd gathered in silence, older residents of Greenville, who still remembered how that family had walked into cabin 4 and never returned. At the front, Mark Wilson stood motionless, a gray suit hanging loose on his frail shoulders. His silver hair fell gently across his forehead, and his eyes lingered on each casket, as if silently promising he had finally brought them home. No music played, no long eulogies, just the sound of wind through dry grass, a faint clink of chains somewhere far off at the dock, and the quiet fall of earth on wood. When the smallest casket bearing the name Eli was lowered, Mark finally bowed his head, pulling from his pocket the old drawing Sarah had once made, the yellowed paper 4 stick figures, a little frog, a big round sun. He placed it gently atop the final casket and stepped back. Douglas Harris stood nearby, arms folded, eyes never leaving Mark. In the crisp air, he gave the faintest nod. Today, Moosehead Lake whispered no more. Its waters only shimmered, waiting for a quiet afternoon. As the funeral ended, Mark slowly made his way back to the dock. He slipped off his shoes, set them neatly on the boards, just as he had 32 years before, and sat down, fingers finding the old fishing line. The black lake lay flat, reflecting his silhouette with a strange kind of kindness. Far above, a circle of crows wheeled in the sky. At the foot of the dock, a tiny frog leapt from a rock landing with a soft plunk, sending ripples outward in perfect circles. Harris stood there, too silent, only watching. He heard Mark murmur softly, as if only to himself, "I'm bringing you home now." And for the first time in many years, Moosehead Lake fell silent.